Hey there, welcome back to Seeds of Meaning. I'm grateful you're here. If you're new, my name is Nick Walker, and this is a space for curious minds, deep thinkers, and anyone looking to reconnect with truth, meaning, and purpose. See, each week we explore books that challenge how we see the world and help us grow intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. So if you've ever felt overwhelmed by the noise and you're looking for something that feeds your mind and nourishes your soul, you're in the right place. Today, we're diving back into Nexus, a brief history of information networks from the Stone Age to AI by Yuval Noah Harari. This episode is all about how documents silently shape the world around us. Not just the paperwork we sign or the forms we fill out, but the deeper systems that define what's real, what's legal, and what's possible. If that resonates with you, I'd love to invite you to subscribe, not just to keep up, but to grow with us as we uncover the hidden forces that shape our lives. And as always, I'd love for you to drop your thoughts in the comments as we go, because this isn't just content, it's conversation. And for some of you, I get what you're thinking. Nick, documents seem boring, but only until you realize that they built the modern world. See, in chapter 3, we're going to explore a network that doesn't shout, doesn't go viral, and doesn't care how many followers you have. Bureaucracy. But not just any bureaucracy. We're talking about documents, archives, licenses, forms, IDs, the silent infrastructure that keeps our society running, but also shapes how power flows and how truth is defined. In this episode, we'll unpack how reducing messy reality into neat categories can distort truth, why documents aren't neutral tools, they're instruments of power, and how the systems we build to create order can also hide or twist reality. We'll talk about the role of paperwork in shaping power, how this paperwork might be more dangerous and more powerful than we've ever imagined. Okay? So, on page 73 in the book, the author says, "At the heart of the bureaucratic order is the drawer. Bureaucracy seeks to solve the retrieval problem by dividing the world into drawers and knowing which document goes into which drawer." Let's unpack this. Bureaucracy isn't just about red tape or government offices. At its core, it's about how we organize the world. Harari is pointing to a shift that changed everything. The moment we moved from remembering things in our minds to recording them on paper. But recording alone isn't enough. The bigger challenge, retrieving what we recorded quickly, accurately, and on demand. So what did we do? We invented drawers. Not just filing cabinets, but metaphorical drawers. We started dividing the world into categories, people, professions, permissions, identities, and with every document, got a drawer. Every person, a form. Every action, a code. It sounds simple, but this small act of filing things into drawers is how entire systems of order, access, and authority are built. It's not just about where things go, it's about who decides where it goes, and that's where the real power lives. This quote matters because it shows us something deeper than just organization. It shows us how power quietly shifted from memory to paper. Before bureaucracy, people relied on human brains to store important information, but brains forget, they distort, they die. Documents, on the other hand, don't. They can store contracts, laws, birth certificates, tax records indefinitely and at scale. And in that way, written documents became more powerful than human memory. But that created a new challenge. How do we find the right document at the right time when we're drowning in paper. That's the retrieval problem. And the solution, drawers. Not just physical drawers, but systems of classification, systems that break down reality into boxes, forms, and categories. It sounds innocent, just a way to stay organized. But Harari wants us to see the hidden cost. These drawers don't just organize facts, they shape how we see the world. Because once you assign someone a category, citizen, employee, immigrant, felon, you also assign them a path or a limitation. And that's why this matters today. The drawer you're placed into can define your future. It can determine your access to healthcare, housing, education, even dignity. That's the power of paperwork. It doesn't just reflect reality, it creates it. Let's bring this idea into sharper focus with something real, something many of us have seen, lived with, wrestled with emotionally: the criminal justice system in the United States. At first glance, it looks like any other bureaucracy. It runs on laws, paperwork, procedures, forms, and databases. But if you slow down and look closer, beneath the legal language and the filing cabinets, you'll see how deeply this system depends on labels. Because every person who interacts with the justice system, whether they're arrested, charged, or incarcerated, is immediately assigned a label: felon, offender, ex-con. And with that label comes a drawer. Literally, paperwork gets filed. Digitally, your name is entered into a database. Socially, your identity gets rewritten in the eyes of others. And once you've been placed into that drawer, it's incredibly hard to get out. Here's what's so disturbing about this. These bureaucratic drawers aren't just about organizing information. They're about shaping lives. Because in America, that label, the drawer you've been placed in, determines what opportunities you can access for the rest of your life. Want to apply for housing? Good luck. Want to get a job? Your drawer gets open first. Want to vote? Your drawer might have already disqualified you. Want to go back to school? That label might block the front door. It's not based on who you are today or what you've overcome or even what you've learned. It's based on the drawer. And what's even more painful is that this system doesn't just affect individuals. It reshapes entire communities, particularly in the Black and brown communities, where over-policing, mandatory quotas, and the war on drugs have pushed more people into these drawers, sometimes for life. So when Harari talks about drawers as the heart of bureaucracy, this isn't abstract. It's not just about filing cabinets and data entry. It's about a system that categorizes human beings and locks their futures behind paperwork. And in that light, bureaucratic drawers become more than a tool for order. It becomes a mechanism of control. This conversation takes me back to one of the most powerful books we've read in the Seeds of Meaning book club, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. That book didn't just inform me, it pierced through my assumptions about justice in this country. One quote in particular still echoes in my mind. Alexander said, "It is the prison label, not the prison time, that matters most if we are to understand the true scope and impact of mass incarceration." And that hit hard because it forced me to see that the real punishment often begins after someone leaves prison. That label follows you into job interviews, into classrooms, onto lease applications. It becomes the drawer you're placed in, silently but powerfully. And once you're in that drawer, the system is set up to keep you there. But Alexander didn't stop there. She also said, Once human beings are defined as the problem in the public consciousness, their elimination through deportation, incarceration, or even genocide becomes nearly inevitable. And that's chilling, because she's showing us what Harari is pointing to. When society reduces people to labels, when bureaucracies simplify complex lives into fixed categories, it creates a psychological permission slip, a justification for harm. And often that harm is invisible because it's written in policies, not shouted in the streets. It's filed away in drawers, stamped with legal language and hidden by the veil of order. That's why this quote matters so much to me, because these aren't just ideas in books. These are stories I've seen play out in real life, through friends, through family, through systems I interact with every day. And what the new Jim Crow helped me realize is this: if we want to change the system, we have to start by challenging the labels it relies on. Because behind every label is a person, and behind every drawer is a future we still have the power to rewrite. So now, I want to bring this back to you, because we're not just talking about history or policy or even books. We're talking about real people and real stories, maybe even yours. So here's the question I'd love for you to sit with. What's a label you've been given or that you've given to someone else that might be too small for the full truth? How has that label shaped the drawer you or someone else got placed into? Has it made life any easier, or has it limited what's possible? And here's a deeper question. What would it look like to step outside that drawer? What happens when we see beyond the label, ours or someone else's, and reclaim the full complexity of who we are? Because systems don't just change through policy. They change when we, the people inside them, start seeing each other differently. So, drop your reflections in the comments, because your story might just help someone else break out of a drawer they didn't even know they were in. And what's the bigger takeaway from all of this? It's that bureaucratic order isn't neutral. It's a form of storytelling, and the stories it tells can either uphold dignity or deny it. At first glance, documents and drawers seem objective, clean, rational. But the truth is, every form, every checkbox, every drawer reflects choices. Who gets included, who gets excluded, and whose complexity gets flattened into a label. And once those labels are on paper, they can follow a person for life. That's what Harari is showing us. The systems we build to create order also build realities. And those realities shape who gets second chances and who doesn't, who gets heard and who gets filed away. So if we want to build a society rooted in truth, equity, and compassion, we have to start by questioning the drawers we've inherited and asking if they're still serving the world that we want to create. Because paperwork isn't just paper, it's power. And the more conscious we are of how that power flows, the more courageous we can be in changing the stories it tells. Let's move on to the second quote on page 74. The author says, "Reducing the messiness of reality to a limited number of fixed drawers helps bureaucrats keep order, but it comes at the expense of truth. Because they are fixated on their drawers, even when reality is far more complex, bureaucrats often develop a distorted understanding of the world." This quote gets to the hidden cost of creating structure. Bureaucracy works by turning real-world complexity into neat categories, what Harari calls drawers. And on the surface, this sounds practical, logical, but the danger isn't in creating order. It's in mistaking that order for the whole truth. Once reality is reduced to a limited set of boxes, those boxes start to shape how we think, how we govern, and how we relate to each other. And soon, the system doesn't just reflect the world, it starts replacing it. That's the distortion Harari warns us about. Because when bureaucrats become fixated on the drawers, they stop noticing the things that don't fit, the edge cases, the contradictions, the individuals who live between labels. And over time, this tunnel vision makes the system less accurate, even if it becomes more organized. So the quote isn't just about how we file documents. It's about how we start filing people, and how that filing can quietly erase the messy, beautiful complexity of real life. This matters because bureaucracy, designed to bring order, can end up distorting truth. Harari warns us that written documents were a major breakthrough. They outperformed human memory. They made it possible to track, record, and systemize information across vast distances and generations. But once you begin organizing reality on paper, you also begin reshaping it. To make information retrievable, bureaucrats had to sort it into drawers, clean, labeled categories. That makes things efficient, but it also makes things misleading because reality, it doesn't fit into drawers. Human experience is messy. Identity is layered. Context matters. And when you reduce the complexity to a series of checkboxes, just so it can be filed away, tracked, and processed, you start to see the world through the lens of those categories. Not what is, but what fits. That's how distortion begins. Not through lies, but through oversimplification. The danger isn't that bureaucrats are malicious. It's that they're methodical. See, they're trained to prioritize clarity over complexity, speed over subtlety, consistency over nuance. And in that trade-off, truth quietly bends. This is how entire systems can end up punishing people, not because of who they are, but because of what drawer they've been placed in. Not because anyone intended harm, but because the system no longer sees the whole person. It only sees the paperwork. Let's bring this idea closer to home with something almost every one of us has experienced: school. From the moment we enter the education system, the labeling begins. Gifted, special ed, troubled, behind. And once those labels are applied, they often follow a student for years, regardless of growth, change, or circumstances. These aren't just descriptions, they're bureaucratic drawers. Each drawer comes with its own expectations, resources, or lack thereof, and assumptions about who a student is and what they're capable of. And just like that, a child becomes a file, a number, a set of accommodations, or a disciplinary code. What started as an attempt to organize and support students often becomes a system that boxes them in, reducing them to the label they've been assigned. And this is where Harari's insight cuts deep. Bureaucracy creates order by simplifying reality, but in doing so, it often creates distortion. A child who struggles to focus might be labeled disruptive. A kid dealing with trauma might be labeled defiant. A student who learns differently might be labeled slow. And over time, these labels don't just shape how teachers treat them, they shape how they see themselves. That's the hidden cost of bureaucratic drawers in education. They can provide structure, but they can also limit opportunity. Because once a student is placed in the wrong drawer, it could take a miracle or determination to pull them out. See, for me, I wasn't born into the gifted drawer. I wasn't labeled exceptional or ahead. I was labeled different. As a child, a reoccurring inner ear infection left me struggling with deafness for many years. Due to infections and a buildup of fluids in my inner ear, I could only hear sounds about as well as someone 6 feet underwater. This challenge was something that quietly but profoundly shaped my experience in school. Imagine sitting in a classroom where you can't catch everything the teacher is saying, where group discussions move too fast, where everyone else seems to understand the joke or the instructions or even the question, except you. It was isolating. Teachers assumed I wasn't paying attention. Other kids assumed I wasn't smart. And the system did what systems do. It put me in a drawer. Special ed is what they called me. Extra help is what they said I needed. Separate rooms is where they put me. Pulled out of class as if it wasn't hard enough. I spent most of my schooling in that drawer. Watched, measured, categorized. And the hardest part wasn't tutoring or the accommodations. It was the silent message underneath it all. This is who you are. This is what you're capable of. Stay in your drawer. But something in me wouldn't settle. I had questions. I had dreams. I had a mind that wanted to explore. If only I could find a way to unlock it. Over time, through support, late nights, and the unconditional love of my mother, who saw past the label, things started to shift. In high school, I began testing at grade level, not because the drawer changed, but because I refused to stay in it. Then community college, and eventually I graduated from the University of Southern California with a bachelor's degree in economics. From special ed to USC Econ, not because the system relabeled me, but because I stopped believing the drawer defined me. Today, I co-teach in a program called Motivating the Teen Spirit, helping young people rewrite the stories they've been told about themselves. Because I've lived it. I know what it's like to be defined by a file, to feel invisible in a system, to question your own intelligence, not because you lack it, but because the drawer you were placed in was too small to hold your brilliance. And now I help others break out of those drawers, to remember that no label can contain their potential, that systems may simplify, but they don't define us. Because the truth is messy. Humans are complex, and no bureaucratic code can capture the fullness of who you are. So let's take a breath, because this quote isn't just about systems, it's about us. So I want to ask you, what drawer were you placed in? Was it gifted or slow? Was it leader or troublemaker? Was it creative or disruptive? And more importantly, who decided? Was it a teacher, a sibling, a parent, a test you took at age 7? And how has that drawer shaped the story you've told about yourself? Maybe you've outgrown it. Maybe you've spent years trying to prove it wrong, or maybe, quietly, it's still holding you back. Here's your invitation. Take a moment to reflect on the labels you've carried and ask yourself, are they still true? Were they ever? And who might you become if you stopped living by someone else's category? Drop your thoughts in the comments or journal them privately. Either way, this is your space to start reclaiming the narrative, because you were never meant to live in a drawer. You were meant to expand. And this brings us back to the heart of what Harari is exposing. Bureaucracy doesn't just organize reality, it replaces it. When we reduce human beings to fixed categories, when we value order over understanding, we create a world that feels efficient, but often isn't just. And here's the thing, bureaucracies aren't inherently evil. They're necessary. We need structure to function at scale. But if we're not vigilant, that structure becomes a story. One where some people always get the benefit of the doubt and others are always presumed deficient. And once that story is baked into our systems, into our schools, courts, hospitals, governments, it becomes invisible. That's the danger of the drawer. It doesn't just uphold information, it defines it. And unless we step outside that system and ask deeper questions, we'll keep mistaking labels for truth, and we'll keep organizing people instead of understanding them. So, the next time you encounter a form, a test, a rule, pause and ask, which drawer is this putting someone in? And who gets to decide what belongs there? Because when we stop blindly trusting the system, we start rewriting the story. Now, if you stuck around with me this far, I appreciate it. The beautiful part of being a part of my community and my journey is that you're going to be able to see some of my mistakes, and you're going to be able to grow with me in this journey. And I appreciate you being here. I need to turn on my television and bring up my logo, so give me a second. And we're back. Now, let's move on to our last quote for today. On page 83, the author says, "Documents, archives, forms, licenses, regulations, and other bureaucratic procedures have changed the way information flows in society, and with it, the way power works. This made it far more difficult to understand power." We usually think of power as something loud: charismatic leaders, fierce speeches, elections, and protests. But Harari wants us to zoom out and look at the silent systems shaping our world beneath the surface. He says if you want to understand how power works, how it really works today, you have to look at how information flows. Not just what information is shared, but how, where, and by whom. And most of that doesn't happen on stages. It happens in the background, in documents, in databases, in policies most people never read. These systems don't scream for attention. They don't go viral, but they do determine who gets a mortgage, who's eligible for healthcare, who's allowed to cross a border or not. And because these systems are wrapped in complexity and paperwork, it becomes harder and sometimes even dangerous to question them. Harari is telling us power has become procedural. And when power is procedural, it hides. This quote is important to understand because it helps us see something crucial. We've lost our way in understanding power. We think of power as personal, something someone has. But Harari is saying power isn't just about people. It's about processes. Because as societies grew more complex, we needed more than kings and commanders. We needed systems. And those systems run on documents, birth certificates, passports, property deeds, permits, policies. And on the surface, they seem neutral, just a tool to stay organized. But they don't just reflect reality. They create it. A form decides whether your loan is approved. A database decides if your license is valid. A policy decides who qualifies for food stamps and who gets kicked off the list. And most of us never meet the person behind the decision because often there isn't one. There's just a process. And that's where power lives now, not in a palace, but in a protocol, not in a ruler, but in a regulation. And when power hides inside paperwork, it becomes harder to understand, harder to hold it accountable. Because how do you protest a filing cabinet? How do you demand justice for a spreadsheet? That's why Harari says bureaucracy didn't just change the way information flows, it changed the way power works. We can't fix what we don't understand. That's why this quote isn't just about paper. It's about pulling back the curtain and seeing where the strings are really being pulled. Let's take a look at one of the most personal yet complex systems we rely on: healthcare. At first glance, it seems organized, maybe even efficient. We have hospitals, we have insurance claims, we have lab reports, diagnostic codes, government regulations. Everything has a form, a file, and a drawer. But beneath that surface, something's off. What we call healthcare system isn't really built to keep people healthy, is it? It's built to manage sickness. Try and follow me here. The longer you're sick, the more profitable you are to insurance companies, hospitals, pharmaceutical firms, and even certain government regulations and programs. Preventative care, nutritional education, root cause healing, those get buried in paperwork or denied altogether. And here's the bigger issue. These problems aren't new. They're just hard to change because we don't clearly understand how power works in these systems. In the book Good Energy, Dr. Casey Means breaks it down clearly. Processed food companies use lobbying to shape food policy and dominate grocery shelves. Pharmaceutical companies fund studies, influence doctors, and push long-term prescription over true healing. Organic farmers are held back by regulation and underfunded by subsidy programs. So, what do? We ask, why are people getting sicker? Why is our food so processed? Why is healthcare so expensive? But we rarely get a straight answer because the power is hidden behind documents, behind drawers, behind the bureaucracy that makes the system feel too big to challenge and too complicated to understand. And that's exactly Harari's point. See, bureaucracy changes the way information flows, and with it, the way power operates. It's not that people don't care, it's that most people don't know where to look or who to hold accountable. Because once power gets filed away into enough drawers, we start forgetting where it even lives. And this is where Harari's insight hits especially hard. Power isn't just about who's in charge, it's about who controls the flow of information. When documents, licenses, archives, and records become the gatekeepers of truth, they also become tools of power. But here's the challenge. Most of us don't see power anymore. We only feel its effects. We wait for approval. We chase signatures, fill out forms, and rarely stop and ask, who designed this process and who's benefiting from it staying this way? In fields like healthcare, food, and politics, we see decisions being made that prioritize profit, not people. But the power behind these decisions is often hidden in paperwork, policies, and procedures. Layers so dense, most people never think to question them. And we're left reacting to symptoms instead of understanding the system. So if we want to reclaim agency in our health, our communities, our democracy, we have to look beyond headlines and elections. We have to examine the invisible networks of bureaucracy that shape our lives. Because understanding power isn't about being cynical, it's about being conscious. And that awareness is the first step toward change. Question: what's a system you've interacted with? Maybe healthcare, education, housing, or government, where you felt powerless or confused by the process. Did you ever stop to wonder why the system works this way? Who benefits from it staying the same? And what would it take to change it? Drop your thoughts in the comments because your story might reveal a piece of the system others haven't seen. And the more clearly we can name these invisible structures, the more power we have to reshape them. So, here's what chapter 3 taught us. 1, Bureaucracy is humanity's silent superpower, designed not just to store information, but to shape behavior. 2. To maintain order, bureaucracies reduce messy realities into neat categories, what Harari calls drawers. 3. When systems obsess over these categories, they start distorting truth, labeling people in ways that can define, limit, or even erase their humanity. And 4, power in modern society isn't just about who leads, it's about who gets to decide how information flows and what stories get filed away. The invitation here is to stop thinking of forms, files, and policies as just paperwork and start seeing them as instruments of influence, because the systems we trust to create clarity can just as easily create blind spots. And of course, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been assigned a label that didn't reflect who you truly are? A drawer you were placed in by school, work, or society that's been hard to escape? Drop your story in the comments, because the more we name these experiences, the more we reclaim our narrative. And if this conversation stirs something in you, I want to personally invite you to join the Seeds of Meaning book club. It's a space where we dive into books like The New Jim Crow, The Psychology of Money, and Nexus. But more importantly, where we grow together. You'll find the link in the description. Thank you for spending this time with me. Chapter 3 reminded me, and maybe you too, that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers from behind a desk, inside a filing cabinet, under the weight of a stamp. I hope this episode helped you see your world and the systems around you with new eyes, because once you see it, you can begin to change it. And if this spoke to you, subscribe, share it, send it to someone else who's asking deeper questions, and join me next time for Chapter 4, Errors, the Fantasy of Infallibility, where we explore what happens when the systems we trust most refuse to admit they're wrong. I'll see you in the next one.